Before Passchendaele became a name whispered in history, it was only a quiet rise of earth between two small villages. The land rolled gently, like a wave frozen in soil, scattered with hedgerows and narrow lanes that remembered the weight of carts and hooves. Farmers worked in silence, their tools sinking into a ground that always felt slightly damp, as if holding back something it didn't wish to release. When rain fell, it didn't soak, it sank, disappearing faster than seemed natural. They said the soil was hungry. Some claimed it had been that way since the old wars, when men in different armor bled into the same dirt. Generations passed, and still the ground held its breath. Coins surfaced after storms. Rusted blades, pottery, and the occasional bone appeared near the roots of poplars. The locals never looked surprised. They simply turned the objects over in their palms, then buried them again, as though returning something borrowed. The fields didn't need to be told what they had seen. They already knew. By 1917, when the soldiers arrived, the land waited with a stillness that was almost reverence. They built their camps and command posts upon what had once been prayer ground, unaware of how deep the memory ran beneath their boots. The first surveyors spoke of strange echoing sounds in the soil, low, hollow thuds that travelled farther than a hammer's strike should. But no one listened. The army measured the terrain in yards, not years, and missed the truth that lay just underfoot. This land had never stopped remembering. The men who arrived to chart the front were trained to see the land as geometry, lines, coordinates, gradients. They unrolled their maps across crates and mud-caked tables, tracing neat blue grids over the brown fields of Flanders. Each square, a measured world, A2, B4, D6. But the land they studied refused such simplicity. Beneath every contour line slept centuries of remains. The engineers didn't know that the ground they labelled had already been mapped many times before. By footsteps, by bones, by floods of earlier wars long turned to legend. When they drove their stakes into the soil, old relics surfaced. A brass buckle, a coin etched with Latin script, a fragment of armour blackened by time. The men laughed, pocketed what they found, and kept digging. They didn't see the pattern forming, that every mark they made disturbed another beneath it. The soil wasn't empty. It was layered with memory, pressed tight like pages of a closed book. At night, when the rain came, the lines on their maps blurred. Ink bled into paper until the boundaries vanished, as though the earth itself rejected being divided. Orders depended on those lines, yet the ground ignored them. The coordinates no longer matched what the men saw before them. Trenches shifted, ridges seemed to move, and distances stretched without warning. It was said that compasses spun when held too long in one place. But no one blamed the land. They blamed the weather, the fog, the war, anything but the quiet intelligence beneath their feet. When the first soldiers reached the rise near Passchendaele, the world had turned to mist. The horizon vanished. Trees became silhouettes, blurred and uncertain, their branches dissolving into a pale, colourless sky. Sound travelled strangely in that weather, too near, then suddenly far, as though distance itself had forgotten how to behave. Orders were murmured, repeated, then lost somewhere between one breath and the next. Even the rifles seemed to hesitate before firing, their reports muffled by air too heavy with moisture to carry echoes. At dawn, the fog deepened. Men could see no farther than a few yards ahead. Shapes moved in the whiteness, human, maybe not. Once a column of figures appeared across a field, walking in silence. When patrols went to meet them, they found nothing but churned earth and the smell of iron. Some said it was the enemy scouting. Others said it was something older, an imprint of men who'd marched that same ground before maps or flags existed. By nightfall, the fog had settled into every crevice of the trenches. It clung to the skin, filled the lungs, blurred the edges of thought. Even the animals grew silent. A few soldiers swore they could hear faint bells, church bells, distant and disembodied, ringing somewhere beyond the mist. Yet no village lay close enough for sound to travel that far. When the sun finally broke through the next morning, it revealed nothing unusual. But those who'd stood the night watch knew better. The line had already been drawn. Not by men, but by the fog itself. It began so quietly that no one noticed. A thin drizzle at dusk, soft enough to pass for evening dew. The men looked up from their trenches and smiled, grateful for a sky that seemed merciful. After days of dust and cordite, the smell of rain felt almost holy. They joked it would wash the blood from the parapets, rinse the air clean. But by nightfall, the sound changed. No longer a patter, but a steady hiss, like breath drawn through the lungs of the earth. By morning, the trenches had turned to rivers. Boots disappeared in brown water. Rifles clogged, bolts grinding with mud that clung like muscle. The sandbags burst first, then the duckboards lifted, floating away like small rafts. Men tried to bail with helmets, laughing at the futility until laughter became silence. The rain pressed on them from all sides, on helmets, shoulders, hearts, an invisible weight that deepened each hour. No one spoke of it at first. They simply endured, believing it would pass. But the days blended and the sky refused to clear. Rations soured. The smell of wet wool and rotting food grew thick enough to taste. Letters home arrived already damp, their words bleeding into the paper as if the storm had travelled with them. The officers blamed poor drainage. The engineers blamed timing. The men blamed no one at all. It was just weather, they told themselves. Until one night, when lightning flashed across the horizon, and for a heartbeat every drop seemed to hang suspended in the air, refusing to fall. The war paused with it, as if even the world had forgotten how to breathe. After the first week, no one remembered what dry felt like. The rain became a constant pulse, soft, endless, and cruelly patient. Every sound was filtered through it. Footsteps, gunfire, even speech seemed swallowed by the downpour. Men stopped trying to stay clean or dry. They slept in their coats, standing upright when they could, half submerged when they couldn't. Their skin turned pale and swollen, soft as wax. When they moved, water trickled from their sleeves as if they were draining away from within. Canvas rotted, rifles rusted before sunrise, bread turned grey with mould, and tobacco disintegrated before it could burn. Letters home blurred into watercolour, the ink washing into blue smudges no one could read. The army issued fresh paper, but even sealed envelopes arrived damp. Nothing escaped the rain. It found every crevice, every wound, every thought. Some men swore the drops grew heavier each night. They said you could feel the sky pressing down, inch by inch, until it seemed the horizon itself had sunk. The world narrowed to the space of an arm's reach. A few feet of mud, the low hum of water moving beneath the surface. When the shells came, the explosions made no echo. The ground simply swallowed the sound. One corporal said it felt as if the sky had joined the war, choosing sides in silence. Others believed the rain wasn't falling at all, that it was rising from the earth instead, seeping upward through every crack and grave, trying to reclaim what had once been buried. And still, the clouds did not break. The men stopped cursing the weather. They began to listen to it, waiting for a reason that never came. The first to notice were the signalmen. Their tents sat apart from the rest, low, dim structures filled with the quiet hum of equipment that never truly slept. In the rain, the radio sets grew temperamental. Dials flickered, tubes hissed. A low murmur threaded through the static like a pulse beneath skin. At first, it was dismissed as interference. German jamming, perhaps, or moisture shorting the lines. But one night, an operator froze mid-transmission. The voice coming through wasn't a code, nor any language he knew. It spoke softly, almost human, as though addressing someone beside him. He replayed it for the others. They listened in silence. The voice was distant, echoing, like someone calling across water. It repeated fragments of words, sometimes names, sometimes coordinates no map contained. When they traced the bearings, they led nowhere. Just open fields drowned in rain. Soon, other stations began reporting the same anomaly. The frequencies changed at random, appearing and vanishing without pattern. A few men heard their own call signs whispered back to them, moments after they'd switched off their sets. One described the sensation as being overheard by the past. The officers ordered all non-essential transmissions stopped. Still, the voices persisted, bleeding faintly through the air like forgotten prayers. Some operators refused to work at night. Others listened longer, unable to stop. One sergeant claimed that if you tuned just right, you could hear music, an old march, played too slow. But when he tried to prove it, the recording came back empty. Only the rain remained, whispering through the wires, as if it had learned the language of men. By the third week, the trenches had become something alive. The ground no longer behaved like ground. It heaved and shifted, swallowing boots, tools, even men. At first, they joked about it, calling it the Flanders tide. But the laughter didn't last. One morning, a private stepped down from the fire step and vanished waist deep into the mud. His comrades pulled until their hands bled, but the suction only tightened. Within seconds he was gone, the surface smooth again, as if nothing had ever been there. Soon, it became routine. One man lost every other day, sometimes more. Rope lines were strung along the trench walls so soldiers could move without sinking. Yet even those were torn away by the weight of waterlogged earth. The mud wasn't just wet. It was dense, heavy with things long buried. When spades struck deeper layers, they hit bone, old bone, not fresh enough to belong to this war. The men began to whisper that the ground was remembering, that it was taking back what belonged to it. A few said they heard movement below, a slow gurgling as though the earth itself were breathing. Patrols grew shorter, quieter. No one wanted to walk alone. When the artillery opened up, shells disappeared without detonation, swallowed whole before they could explode. The officers called it bad soil. The chaplains called it a test of faith. But at night, when the rain softened and the wind fell still, the mud seemed to shift again. Small ripples passing through it, like something turning in its sleep. Those who stood watch swore they could feel it breathing back. It began as a rumor, soft, uncertain, carried along the line by word of mouth. Men claimed that, on certain nights, when the rain eased and the wind turned east, a faint melody drifted through the fog. No instruments, no voices, just a slow, distant hum that seemed to rise from the flooded ground itself. Some said it sounded like a hymn. Others swore it was a marching tune played backwards, the rhythm stretched and drowned by the air. The officers dismissed it as wind in the wire, but those who heard it knew better. Wind doesn't follow tempo. One sentry described it as a sound both near and far, like being remembered by something he couldn't see. Another said it carried warmth, a strange calm, as though whoever sang did not wish them harm. For a few moments, the war seemed to pause, the noise of artillery fading into background thunder. Only the melody remained, steady, patient, ancient. Then came the dreams. Men woke soaked in sweat, claiming they'd heard the same song inside their sleep. Closer this time, almost whispering their names. The chaplain walked the line with his lantern, praying under his breath, but even he admitted to hearing a faint vibration in the air, a note that clung to the mist long after silence should have returned. In the morning, no trace of it remained. The mud, the rain, the fog, all still, as if nothing had ever sung at all. But by evening, when the last light faded and the first drops began again, a few men tilted their heads and listened. Somewhere beneath the earth, the song continued, waiting to be remembered. The letters from Passchendaele all carried the same refrain. It hasn't stopped raining. The ground moves when I stand still. Everything smells like iron and rot. Some were carefully written, others scrawled in pencil that had softened from moisture, the graphite bleeding into grey smears. Many never reached their destinations. Those that did arrived already warped, edges curled, paper translucent. The ink fused into the fibres like veins beneath skin. Families at home unfolded them gently, unsure if they were meant to be read or mourned. Archivists later found bundles of these messages in waterproof tins, sealed and forgotten near the trenches. Inside, the words had melted together, sentences merging into clouds of blue and black. You could still make out fragments. Cold. Sleep. Mother. E's still raining. It was as though the rain had tried to rewrite what the soldiers could not say aloud. A few officers ordered that correspondence be dried near the stoves, but the moment the envelopes touched heat, the words vanished completely, ink evaporating into pale ghosts of language. Some believed the damp had preserved them, that the rain wanted to keep their thoughts close, unspoken yet eternal. In the field hospitals, nurses noticed the same thing. Letters slipped from dying hands already wet, as if carried from another shore. One wrote that she could smell rain on the envelopes even when they came from miles away. The war had found a way to travel through paper, an invisible tide linking the living and the lost. And when the last words finally faded, the silence they left behind felt heavier than the storm itself. By the middle of August, the earth at Passchendaele no longer seemed solid. It shifted underfoot, not with movement, but with pulse. Men said they could feel it at night. Small tremors running through the trenches, like the slow exhale of something vast buried beneath them. At first, they blamed water pressure or shells collapsing the soil. But even when no rain fell, the ground continued to stir, breathing through the cracks. One private swore he saw the mud rise and settle, gentle as a chest in sleep. The reflection of the moon trembled across its surface, turning the ripples into pale veins of light. He called for others, but when they came, the earth was still again, slick and quiet, as though listening. The engineers insisted it was gas escaping from decayed matter. Perfectly natural, they said. Yet the air around the trenches felt wrong. Heavy, electric, aware. Animals sensed it first. Mules refused to move forward. Dogs barked at empty craters, their hackles stiff. Even the rats avoided certain places, their trails veering sharply, as if around an invisible edge. Some nights, the vibrations grew so steady that the men began timing them, waiting for the next faint lift beneath their boots. They said it followed a pattern, not random, not weather. It was breathing, they whispered, slow and deliberate. When the artillery fire paused, the silence carried that hidden rhythm, the soundless inhalation of the land itself. By dawn, nothing moved. The mud stilled, thick and quiet. But in their bones, they felt it lingering, the uneasy certainty that the battlefield was alive and listening to them sleep. By September, the casualty lists grew longer than the trenches themselves. Yet the number of graves never matched the number of names. Men went missing without witness, swallowed between patrols, their rifles later found standing upright in the mud. The land offered no explanation, no trace. It was as if it had begun collecting what it was owed. Graves registration worked without rest, marking the fields with wooden crosses that leaned and sank almost as soon as they were placed. Each morning, half were gone, tilted, submerged, or carried off by the shifting sludge. Absorption, the reports called it. But those who had to dig knew better. The mud closed over the shovels like a clenched fist, refusing to give anything back. Locals whispered that the ground had reclaimed its dead. They told stories of earlier wars when soldiers vanished the same way, whole battalions erased by rain. The veterans listening didn't laugh. They'd seen the mud move, slow and patient, swallowing without sound. Some said the fields breathed easier afterward, as though relieved. Chaplain Walker described the battlefield as a cathedral without walls. He said prayers there felt different, heavier, harder to speak, as if the words met resistance in the air. Even his voice carried an echo that wasn't his own. By late autumn, the markers had all but disappeared. Only faint impressions of the crosses remained, silhouettes pressed into the wet clay. When the wind passed over them, the puddles shivered, forming ripples that spread in perfect circles. Those who saw it didn't linger. They turned away, knowing some graves didn't need markers because the land itself remembered. The report was found decades later, sealed in a tin cylinder among the ruins of a forward observation post. The paper was water-stained, the type faint but legible. Its author, Lieutenant Robert Hale of the Royal Engineers, had been assigned to study ground stability around the flooded trenches north of the ridge. His words began with the precision of an officer: coordinates, soil density, moisture depth. Then the tone changed. He described a hollow beneath the surface, vast, irregular, resonant. His measurements showed vibrations he couldn't account for, rhythmic and low, echoing through the ground like distant thunder that never reached the sky. He noted that the tremors intensified during the night hours, particularly after rainfall, and that when he stood still, he could feel a pulse in the mud, as though the land were moving of its own accord. The report ended abruptly, mid-sentence. The last line read, "Recommend further excavation to confirm if cavity contains," and nothing more. The final page was warped. The ink bloomed outward like a bruise, the words dissolving into grey stains. Hale was listed missing 2 days later. His name appears on no grave. When the file resurfaced, archivists dismissed it as incomplete. The hollow was never found, the area long reclaimed by farmland. Yet local surveyors still report unusual ground resonance in that same grid. On calm nights, when the air is still and heavy with moisture, a faint vibration rises through the soil, a slow, steady beat, like something below still waiting to be acknowledged. The post stood alone on the ridge, a narrow dugout reinforced with sandbags and tin, half collapsed from weeks of rain. Its single occupant, Corporal Elwood, had been assigned to monitor enemy movement through the valley below. He kept a notebook, marking times when artillery fired or flares broke the clouds. Most nights were uneventful, but one evening, after the guns fell silent, he noticed something he'd never heard before: silence that rang. The absence of sound was so complete, it became a presence of its own. No wind, no birds, No dripping water. The air seemed held in suspension, waiting for a cue that never came. Elwood wrote that it felt like standing inside someone else's breath. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving along the flooded trench. He called out, assuming it was a messenger. There was no reply, only the rhythm of boots in shallow water, drawing nearer, then fading without direction. He reported it the next morning, but his sergeant dismissed it as nerves. "You've been listening too hard," he said. Yet the sound returned, always between 2 and 4 a.m., when the fog pressed closest to the earth. Elwood began to count the intervals, discovering a strange consistency. 43 steps. Pause. 43 more. On his last entry, the handwriting changed, shaky, uneven. "The steps are under me now," he wrote. "They aren't walking, they're waiting." His body was never recovered. When relief arrived at dawn, they found the listening post empty, the lamp still burning, its flame steady and unmoving, as though the air itself refused to disturb the quiet he'd left behind. It happened during one of the few clear mornings in late October. A patrol from the 9th Battalion had gone ahead to scout a line of shell craters beyond the ridge. The fog was lifting, thin and silver, the kind that turns the horizon into glass. Through it, they saw movement, an entire column advancing slowly across the open field. Dozens of figures, all in formation, rifles shouldered, their silhouettes sharp against the pale light. At first, relief swept through the men. Reinforcements, they thought. The uniforms looked British, though darker somehow, their shapes shifting as the mist wove between them. The patrol waved flares, signaled recognition, but the line of soldiers never broke stride, never turned. When the mist thickened again, the shapes blurred, folding into the white. Moments later, the field was empty. Not a footprint remained in the mud. The officer in charge, Lieutenant Fairhurst, wrote in his log that the figures moved as though bound to memory, not to ground. He ordered a search, but the only tracks found were their own, circling back to the same position. The men returned pale and silent. That night, one soldier claimed he'd seen the column again, marching through the downpour, their rifles gleaming faintly in flashes of lightning. Others stayed awake to watch, and some swore they saw it too. A ghost regiment walking without sound, advancing through rain that didn't touch them. Fairhurst never spoke of it again. His final report ended with a single line: "The dead are still keeping time." In the months that followed, the area became known among survivors by another name: the March of Echoes. They found the notebook first, half buried beside a trench wall, its pages swollen and fused together by mud. The writing was faint, the last line barely legible. "It called me by name." The rest was a blur of ink and water. No one knew who it belonged to until they unearthed a single dog tag nearby, pressed flat by the weight of the earth. The name read Private Samuel Hensley, 23rd Division. He'd been missing for weeks, presumed drowned in one of the flooded communication trenches. When the report reached headquarters, it was filed without comment. Men went missing every day, yet those who'd served with Hensley remembered the nights before he vanished. He'd spoken little, but his eyes followed things the others couldn't see. Small movements along the parapet, shadows that shifted against the light of flares. He told one comrade he'd heard someone whispering his name from the mud itself, soft and deliberate, not through air, but through the ground, vibrating up through his boots. 2 nights later, he was gone. No struggle, no sign of desertion, just an empty rifle propped against the trench wall. They searched until dawn, calling his name into the fog. The only reply was the slow drip of rain returning to the same spot. Years after the war, when archaeologists excavated that section of the line, they uncovered the tag again, corroded, but intact. The soil around it was strangely warm, even in autumn chill. One of the workers swore he heard a voice then, distant and low, speaking through the dirt. When the rain finally stopped, the silence felt unnatural, thick and hollow, as though the world had forgotten how to move. The fields lay flat and colourless, reflecting a pale, exhausted sky. Where trenches once ran like open veins, only shallow scars remained, filled with standing water that glimmered faintly in the weak sun. The air smelled of rust and moss, of something long drowned and newly awake. Men emerged from dugouts blinking, dazed by light. They moved cautiously, testing the ground as if it might give way again. For the first time in months, the sound of boots met resistance instead of surrender. But the relief was uneasy. Without the constant drum of rain, every small noise seemed amplified. The creak of leather, the groan of wood, the soft hiss of steam rising from the drying mud. The survivors began to speak of ghosts then, not as superstition, but as fact. They said the battlefield breathed differently now, its rhythm broken. Some nights, mist rose without warning, coiling low across the ground in shapes that almost resembled men. Others swore they heard faint whispers underfoot, like air escaping the earth. By dusk, the horizon glowed with the dull red of distant fires, the last artillery strikes echoing somewhere beyond memory. The men watched in silence, uncertain if the war had ended or merely paused. The land was still wet enough to hold a reflection, and in it they saw not their own faces, but the blurred outline of something waiting to surface again. A century later, the land around Passchendaele looks peaceful. The scars have softened into meadows, the trenches into gentle hollows. In spring, poppies bloom where the water once pooled, their red petals trembling against a sky that no longer weeps. Farmers till the soil carefully, mindful of what lies beneath. They say that after heavy rain, the ground still exhales, a faint sigh rising through the grass, as if the battlefield remembers how to breathe. Tourists come in summer, walking the trails in quiet reverence. They pause beside the memorial stones, unaware that the air carries more than wind. Some claim they feel a vibration through their shoes, a subtle rhythm beneath the stillness. One local guide calls it the heartbeat of the hill. He says it's strongest after storms, when the earth is heavy and the scent of wet iron fills the fields. Every few years, the ploughs uncover fragments, buttons, bullets, the curved rim of a helmet. Each find is handed over to the museum, catalogued and stored. But some objects are quietly reburied, returned to the soil with a silent nod, as if disturbing them might wake something best left sleeping. On clear evenings, mist sometimes gathers without warning, tracing the old lines of the trenches. From a distance, it looks like smoke from forgotten fires. The villagers say it's just weather, nothing more. Yet when the wind drops and the fields fall utterly still, you can almost hear it. The faint rhythmic pull of air below your feet, steady as a memory refusing to fade. Passchendaele is quiet now, but when the rain returns, the silence deepens. It falls softly across the meadows, soaking into soil that once swallowed entire generations. To most, it is only weather, grey clouds over green fields. But those who linger long enough begin to sense something else. The rain sounds different here. Each drop lands with weight, as though striking memory instead of earth. Locals say the rain has a voice. On some nights, if you listen beyond the wind, you can hear it whispering. Fragments of words no one speaks anymore, syllables blurred by time and water. Some hear prayers, others hear names. Farmers who have lived here their whole lives no longer try to decide which is true. They simply bow their heads when storms come, letting the sound pass through them like confession. Historians call Passchendaele a tragedy of mud and command, a mistake etched into textbooks. But to those who stand there in the rain, it feels less like history and more like presence. Something vast, patient, and aware. The land has learned to keep its silence, but the sky never forgets. Every drop that falls is a small remembrance, a note in a hymn still being written. At sunset, when the fields turn gold and the puddles catch the last light, it's easy to imagine the voices still beneath the surface, breathing in rhythm with the storm. The rain remembers what men could not bear to say, and when it falls, it does so gently, as if afraid to wake them.